Hello, everybody. This is Dennis Prager, and welcome to the show known as the Dennis Prager Show. And forgive me for having the same name. It's not an issue of arrogance. It's just there's no better name to tell you what the show is, I guess. So this is a very I hate it, so cliched. This is a very special hour. Every hour either has to be special or I should do other work. Nevertheless, having said that, there is something special, nevertheless, about this hour. I have followed my entire life the question of does science negate God? I have always been deeply, deeply interested in the questions and the challenges regarding God's existence. And as a result, I was always aware of the atheist Anthony Flue of Oxford and then of York University in Canada. And he really was the guru, if you will, of philosophical atheism. And now he has announced, to his enormous credit, because he said, look, I follow Socrates and I go where the evidence leads. He did not have, as I believe many atheists do, he did not have an emotional commitment to atheism. He had an intellectual commitment. And when the intellectual barriers seemed to have dissipated, Anthony Flue, Professor Flue, decided that there is a God. There is this supreme being who designed the universe. And he cited two thinkers who provided the scientific basis to have him affirm that there is a God. One is a Catholic, Roy Abraham Varghese, and his book, among others, The Wonder of the World, A Journey from Modern Science to the Mind of God. And the work of my guest now, the other person who was apparently influenced, not apparently, who has explicitly influenced one of the great atheist thinkers of our time to believing in God, and that is Gerald Schroder. And let me tell you a little about Dr. Schroder. He is the author of Genesis and the Big Bang, The Science of God, and The Hidden Face of God. He earned his Ph.D. at MIT before moving to laboratories at the Weizmann Institute, the Hebrew University, and the Volcani Research Institute in Israel. And he lives in Jerusalem with his family, and Dr. Schroder is my guest now. And thank you for taking the time to be with me.
No, thanks for having me, Dennis. I'm delighted to be on your show.
Thank you. I let me ask the human question first, then we'll talk about the scientist and about theism. How did it feel to be cited by perhaps the leading atheist in the world as one who brought him to God?
I tell you, it was a bolt out of the blue. I arrived one day at work about to teach a class, and one of the teachers grabs me, gives me a hug, and says, "Congratulations." I thought he was happy I arrived on time.
or that you didn't realize your wife was pregnant.
Yeah, or that.
Right.
That's a few years in the past. But yeah, and then I had known that Anthony Flue was changing. I had no idea that it was the Hidden Face of God, my third book, that brought him around. It's very pleasing, I'll tell you. It's not like pride, but it's pleasing. I can't deny it any other way.
Well, it ought to be, of course. Why would you write it if it is not to hopefully influence some atheists?
Yeah. Well, it influenced me, Dennis. It sounds strange, but the data, as I searched deeper and deeper into the workings of life, the third book, The Hidden Face of God, is very strongly into how life works, how the simplest reactions in our body or any forms of life, the complexity. And when you get deeper and deeper into that, a kind of an intelligence shines through. And I think that's what Anthony Flue saw. If there's a mind shining through these phenomenal complexities of which we're involved, and we just take it for granted because it's all in a human body. It's all hidden underneath the skin, so you don't see any of those magnificent reactions. But when you lay them out and define them and describe them, it's hard to see it any other way other than some kind of a mind active in the system.
Now, I need to note that Varghese is an Eastern Rite Catholic layman. I had mentioned him as the other person. Are you familiar with him?
Oh yeah, Roy. Yes.
Oh, you know each other.
Yes, we met after Anthony had made his change. Roy had contacted me, and we've met and actually produced a video together, working to try to cement, to show explicitly what the information was that changed. Because I mean, I just think of a person like Professor Flue. All of his colleagues, for all of his professional life, have seen him embedded in a certain mindset, and to have as you were saying before, to have the courage, actually.
It is.
I mean,
it's absolute courage.
He has to face his colleagues the next day. It's
Yes,
not like
that's right.
He's on an island by himself.
That's right.
And people that have patted him on the back for decades as the most quoted. One of the treatises he wrote on the falsification of God was the most widely quoted philosophical paper for 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
And now he just changes it around. I mean, I'm in awe of the fact that a person has the courage to do this, frankly, because, I mean, it's he's got to see his colleagues the next day, and it's a different person they see.
That's right. It would be fascinating for him to write about how they reacted to him.
Yeah.
You know, which reminds me, let me tell my producer, Alan, we must try to get Professor Flue on, if indeed he's publicly speaking that much. Now, it's interesting to me that it was not the Big Bang and Genesis that moved him, but as much as your other book, The Hidden Face of God.
Yes.
Now, why do you think that is? Is it a more persuasive, I don't mean you are more persuasive, but do you think that speaking about that is more persuasive than talking about the Big Bang and Genesis?
Yeah, yes. The Big Bang and Genesis could have an agenda, the Bible. The complexity of life is a given fact. It just wasn't, 50 years ago it wasn't, 40 years ago. Who knew molecular biology has changed the face of the understanding. The Hidden Face of God is not a theological book, but the reality of if you want to call it theology, or the reality of a super intelligence shines through, and I bring that out consistently in the text. But it's a very objective, non-subjective description of what's going on, because one does not need to subjectively color the amazingness of life.
Why do you think that could not have been known 40 years ago?
Because molecular biology has changed the face of evolution.
So the more we know, it's almost exponential in the complexity that we realize?
Yeah, I think the shortcoming of words is that complexity is really too. I don't know there's any word. Complex. We see a watch, we think it's complex. We see how a motor works in an automobile, it's highly complex.
Right.
That's trivial. And Dennis, I don't say this casually. It's trivial to compare that to the complexity of just to flex your finger or blink your eye. There's not a dream. If a person hasn't studied molecular biology, and that's what I bring down in the text. I bring a lot of, in layman's terms, I bring the molecular biology that runs your body and allows a mind to emerge from a brain. Complexity the word complex doesn't describe it. It's too small. I don't know if there's any word in the English language that can handle it.
And that's obvious. It's interesting. My older brother is a physician. He's a professor of medicine at Columbia University, and he went. And I only mention this because it's him. I wouldn't even mention it about. It's like the H bomb we call it in America. He went to Harvard Medical School, and he told me, I was in high school at the time, but he told me, Dennis, I look at a cell under the microscope, and to me that's the single greatest argument for God's existence. And that is about, let's see, he's 6, so it is 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And I agree, I'm a layman, so I totally trust you that we know so much more today, but I've never understood why the eye or walking or thinking didn't suggest a designer. Is the level of evidence now just so overwhelming that?
I think so. Excuse me.
Yeah, no, please.
It used to be we called it the God of the gaps. Oh, we can't explain it, so that things that we didn't know. But reality, what demonstrates the presence of a divine mind isn't the gap. It's having explained the gap literally in molecular terms. As to say, we now understand how certain functions occur, and the. Well,
all right, you'll continue the thought in a moment, and then I want to ask you about, does God make mistakes? We'll be back in a moment. Gerald Schroder, I'm Dennis Prager. I'm Dennis Prager, and I'm speaking to Dr. Gerald Schroder. And his book, The Hidden Face of God, has changed the mind of the world's leading atheist. It's a remarkable story. As much a credit to Dr. Schroder and his book as it is to the intellectual courage of Anthony Flue. And I keep emphasizing that, and have from the beginning. As I said earlier, Dr. Schroder, there are people who have positions, whether belief or non-belief, regarding God and or religion, that are, and some on both sides, that have a psychologically vested interest or an emotional investment rather than an intellectual realization. And so it is a tremendous credit to him. Now back to your book. I did not read this book, this one. I had you on, I believe, about God and Genesis, God and the Big Bang. And this one, is it accessible to the layman about the complexity of life?
Oh, yeah. Yes. It's probably the publisher. Can I mention the publisher?
Oh, of course.
Simon & Schuster.
Simon & Schuster. Not only can you mention it, we're putting it on our website so that people can get it.
Ah, wonderful.
No. It is a non-issue, but it is accessible. It's not a series of chemical formulas.
No, of course not. No, I mean, the reason I mentioned Simon & Schuster because it's told in layman's language. I mean, Anthony Flue is not a scientist; he's a philosopher.
Right. Good point. That is a good point.
It spoke to him.
All right.
Thank God, a few people.
Let me ask you the question that bothers everybody, and it may be a silly question, and you are totally free to say it's a silly question, and I mean that sincerely.
I've only heard silly answers, very few silly questions.
Okay, that's very sweet of you. That's what I tell audiences, and that is the truth, by the way. That as a lecturer, I will say that I've almost never been asked a silly question. But in any event, in the sense of silly, not that I'm foolish, but that it may just be an obvious question that has no answer. But what do you do with, if God is in the complexity of nature, or not within, if God is the author of this infinite complexity, and you say complexity is not even a good enough word, fair enough, but Siamese twins are born. What happened? Deformed babies are born. What happened? Did God?
Tsunami wipes away.
Well, all right, that's fine. Tsunami's fine. Okay, I'll live with that, and I deal with it constantly on the show and in talks and writings. But since you base the belief in God, in at least intellectually, in large measure, on this is the great designer, did God design these things, or do they thwart His will?
The essence of creation of the world from a biblical theological point of view is that there's a concept in the Hebrew word is tzimtzum, contraction, that God pulls back and allows a slack in the system, a granted autonomy. For the world to look natural, which has to, if you want to have free will, the world has to look natural, there will be things like earthquakes, and I've heard on the news mudslides, tremendous. The world, God pulls back and allows a leeway in how God controls the world. Although theologically we say that God is present, God nonetheless, from the biblical point of view, there's a statement in Isaiah, which is one of the key statements in this interaction between the divine and the created, the creator and the creator. And it reads like this: I am a God, there's nothing else. I form light and I create darkness. I make peace and I create evil. Now, there's a complexity there. I form light and I create darkness. Well, one of the metaphors for God in the Bible is light. The Psalms is full of it. So if you're the source of all light and you want darkness, I form light and I create darkness, you have to pull back some of the light. It's defining the word creation. Creation is a God from the divine point of view. It's a lessening of God's manifest presence. Okay, I make that clear. Manifest presence, which allows a slack in the system. Now, it had always been assumed that identical causes produce identical effects, and then we discover quantum uncertainty, and there's a slack in the system. Physics has come to agree with the 3,000-year-old understanding that there is a leeway. So does God allow these errors to take place? Well, I think the place to really find this out is in the Bible itself. By chapter 6 of Genesis, now there are 187 chapters in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. By chapter 6, God says, I regret having made mankind. It's a straight statement in the Hebrew and the English translate perfectly. What do you mean God regrets? God has regrets. The text says it explicitly. In other words, it's not an added on that some commentators added. The text says God says, I regret having made mankind, and then comes the flood. So how can it be that we have this statement? The reality is in how God runs the world is that things run by themselves, and that from time to time God steps in manifestly and changes the system. The flood is a classic example. Before the flood, people were living to 900 years. People should never get hung up on the idea whether you could or whether you couldn't. It's the message I'm looking at, okay? Following the flood, lifespans gradually dropped down to 90 years. What's the message? For the big molecular engineer in the sky, God, 900-year-old people were not a good idea. Too much free will. 90 years works a little bit better. And do you hear, Dennis? You hear him saying that God says, "I regret having made the system what I did." Brings on the flood. Lifespans start to drop gradually. The next 10 generations, lifespans drop. The numbers are right in the text. Just pick them out of Genesis. Drop from 900-year-old to 90-year-old. And I repeat myself, one shouldn't get hung up on the idea of whether people could or couldn't live to 900 years. That's not the question. The question is what's the message?
By the way, you may find this. You cited Isaiah, and I believe that's 45:7.
Yes.
You cited it though. Interestingly, I assume you're an Orthodox Jew.
Yes. Well, more or less, yes.
Okay. Moral. I love that. I'd love to know what that means. You have no idea, but I'm not going to go there right now. But that's the rabbinic rephrasing of what Isaiah said. Isaiah said, I create good and evil. The rabbis changed it to light and dark.
Well, there's two parts of the sentence. I form light and I create darkness. I make peace and I create evil. There's two parts in the sentence.
Okay, fine, fair enough, because you cited the first part.
Yeah.
Because God is behind evil. Behind in the sense of He's created everything, and we have to work with that. So you don't. So to you, and I have no agenda here. I just want to understand. To you, then, children with deformities and tsunamis do not present any theological problem.
It's a sad problem, but it provides sadness and empathy, but it's not an argument against the presence of God. I mean, by chapter 4, God has let Cain murder Abel.
Well, that's evil. That's human choice, but tectonic plates is God's choice.
Good point.
So
yes,
that's why. Gerald Schroder, let me just reintroduce you. We've got to take a break. Gerald Schroder is the author of many books, including The Hidden Face of God, which changed Anthony Flue from atheist to theist. The greatest known atheist, Anthony Flue, professor from Oxford and York University in Canada, announced that two people had influenced him so much that he has now believes that there is a God. And one of them is Gerald Schroder, who is a professor in Israel, and who has written the book that did it, at least for Anthony Flue, one of the two books. The other we had mentioned by this Roy, is it Varghese?
Yes.
The Hidden Face of God. All right, so we have dealt with God. God has contracted and allowed nature to take its course.
To some extent, by stepping in from time to time.
Yes. Okay. All right. I look. I live with that. To me, to me, there is peace in knowing that a God governs the universe. Let me though go to the next question, and then I want to get some of the evidence. What you would offer as the greatest example of this infinite complexity that just makes it overwhelming that there is an intelligence. There is one gap here, not in your logic at all, but there is one gap that needs to be traversed, and that is, okay, there is a designer. How do we know that this designer cares about his design?
Perfect. That was in a discussion I had with Anthony when I met him finally after all this change to take place, was one of the questions that came up. To see whether there's any, in other words, did God just wind up the universe and let it run?
Yes.
I mean, that would be the alternative. Right. I think if we look at the flow of existence in the world, the flow of life, it appears that further and further downstream from the creation, from the Big Bang creation, further and further into existence, it appears that there's a divine imprint that shows up again and again, which implies an ongoing interest of this creator into the world itself. And I'd like to, can I explore that a bit?
Yes, of course.
Sure. Okay. I mean, if you think I think many persons are not aware of the fact that the Big Bang did not produce anything solid. It didn't produce scrambled eggs or whatever, or whatever. And it didn't produce protons and neutrons and electrons, the particles of atoms. The Big Bang produced one thing and one thing only from the material world, and that's energy, light beams. The fancy name is electromagnetic radiation, but the reality is just super energetic light beams. Dennis, those light beams are the only physical creation. All of physics holds by this. The fact that all of biblical theology holds by this isn't so relevant at the moment, but that happens to be the case. Let's just stay with the science of the world. All of science holds by the fact that the creation brought forth, as far as the material part besides space and time, light beams, super energetic light beams. Those light beams became alive. We look around the world and we look back in evolution. We say, "Oh, can there be a monkey in our family tree?" Go back. We don't have a monkey in the. We may or may. We probably do, but we go back. We have rocks and water 4 billion years ago. Go back earlier. You have stardust, and go back to the very beginning. Light beams. The way I see it is like this: if I had a block of ice, and then I had over here a kettle out of which a white cloud was coming out, we call it steam. If I didn't know the reality, I would never believe that the steam is made of H2O, water, and the ice is made of H2O. Ice happens to be low energy water. Steam has to be high energy water. But it's all H2O, even though they look totally different. The metaphor I'm getting at here is we are, as strange as this will sound, condensed light beams. The Big Bang produced light beams. The light beams somehow condensed into matter, and the matter became alive. I apologize for making it sound...
I love it.
It's not New Age. It's as old as physics, as old as quantum mechanics. Can light beams become alive? This is the discussion we had with Anthony that because he originally said, okay, a mind, a divine force in the mind, but then perhaps steps back and lets it run. How do light beams become alive? Or I won't go that far. Light beams become protons and neutrons and electrons, but those protons, neutrons, and electrons are condensed light beams, because that's what, just like ice is condensed water and steam is vaporous water. They're all H2O. They're all water. We may see oatmeal and people and etc., but it's still fundamentally light beams. It's not that they've disappeared from the scene. They've just changed form. And 4 billion years ago on the Earth, those light beams became rocks and water that became alive.
This is too much, and I have so much to react. This is just, I'm sitting with a big smile on my face. Gerald Schroder and the hidden face of God who influenced Anthony Flue. I'm Dennis Prager. We'll be back in a moment. All righty, everybody. Ann, if you'll please put up the professor so that I might be able to take some calls. Thank you. Professor Gerald Schroder in Jerusalem. He is one of the two scientists. Although, is Roy Verghese a scientist?
He was more of a philosopher.
Yeah. So the one
He's a high tech. He was in high tech.
Right.
He's a scientist engineer.
Well, so one of the two writers, and this is the scientist Gerald Schroder, who has changed Anthony Flue's mind that there must be a God, and it is because of the staggering complexity. By the way, I need to react to this fascinating statement that in effect we are all, what is it? Electronic beams?
Light beams.
Light
We're
beams.
Condensed light beams.
We are condensed light beams.
Not in effect, in reality.
In reality. I love that fact. I love it because that argues to me so powerfully for a God. For God. Now, in that same sense, can one respond to those religious people who are very worried about evolution as undermining faith in God, that we are no more an ape than we are a light beam? Or do you have, what is your take on evolution?
I prefer calling it development. That I think for certain life developed from the simple to the complex. When you look at some of the details, it seems that the finger of God is present, and we were discussing whether God just winds it up or not. The first aspect of evolution would be 4 billion years ago, rocks and water became alive. I mean, there was non-living matter on the earth, and life started. Immediately, most persons are not aware of the fact that there weren't billions of years between the earth cooling enough so there could be liquid water. The earth was molten, crust cooled to a temperature where there could be liquid water, and life starts like that. Bingo. I mean, the oldest rocks that can bear fossils already have fully formed bacteria undergoing mitosis, undergoing reproduction. So the first of the questions is, how does life come out of rocks and water? Because that's what happened. I mean, that's just a reality. So what we look at, when you look at the details of what we call evolution, the major jumps that occur, it looks to me, and it looked to Anthony also, that there was in fact the finger of God present in these or the hand of, how do you want to say it, a divine influence? Don't want to be prejudicial. God, just divine influence. Dennis, how do you explain? You take one mix of protons, neutrons, and electrons, the things that make up an atom. Take one particular mix, you get a grain of sand. Take the identical protons, neutrons, and electrons in a different combination, you get the brain of an Einstein, or a mind that can produce a Beethoven's violin concerto that can move you to tears. The unlikelihood of this happening without some other type of matrix of, I don't use like matrix of the movie, but the matrix has been around before the movie was around. The idea of a matrix within which all existence is embedded, and that matrix is mind. Mind predates the Big Bang. That in my opinion, I no longer have any question about that. Not from a theological point of view. Theological is totally in accord with that. But the very nature of existence, light beams becoming rocks and water.
So for you, let there be light prior to any of the celestial lights is the trademark, almost proof of the scientific accuracy of the Genesis account.
That's in my second book, the Science of God. I go through day by day and year by year, and show the concordance, the confluence of the two. Science discovers more and more relative to what the Torah has been claiming in the ancient commentaries in the Torah. The match is, I say, literally unnerving. It's just extraordinary, without bending any of the biblical text or bending any of the science. The two come together, age-wise, year-wise. In the subtlety of the text, the information flows out.
Let me take some calls, if I may. Okay, Professor?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, it's just fine.
Frank in El Cerrito, California, in the Bay Area. Dennis Prager, hi.
Hi, Dennis. How are you?
Okay, thank you.
There's a very interesting subject to me. I guess what I want to say is that complexity itself isn't an argument for God. That there's a new, not actually that new, type of mathematical discipline called complex systems theory, which deals with systems with many variables and feedback. And they've developed many types of computer models that do things like artificial life algorithms and algorithms to listen to voices and understand them. and they're made by this type of algorithm. And what they do is they use an evolutionary process of trial and error to build up whatever they want to build up in the system, in voice recognition to recognizing vowels or recognizing speech as such. And then over time, they develop these programs which do that. And if a human being looks at these programs and tries to logically understand them, they can't. They're a complete mess. They look exactly like a complex human body or a complex organism that we can now build up in artificial life situations. We can build up things which resemble the complexity of life, and not only the complexity, but the sort of illogical mishmashiness of life that we see. And when we compare systems that were designed logically by an intelligent designer and systems that were designed by evolutionary algorithms, we see that life itself resembles evolutionary algorithms and doesn't at all resemble things that are, quote-unquote, intelligently designed.
By the way, you're an engineer with NASA?
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Schroder?
Yep. First of all, I would reply to that along the lines of the fact that unless a system recognizes the order. Now, no one will deny the fact that the complexity of life is a massive system of order, chemical reactions going phenomenally beautifully.
Of course.
The laws of thermodynamics make it very clear that unless the system recognizes the order and locks it in, although random reactions can produce order spontaneously, the order always degrades. Not sometimes, not rarely, always degrades.
But what you're saying isn't actually true with system theory.
Unless the system is programmed and knows that that's the order that it's aiming for, or that it knows the order is present. Otherwise, mountains wash to the sea and bodies decay and degrade.
All right, and I have one question for Frank, and mull it over during the break, and we'll come back. The fact is, though, that those algorithms were produced by people. That's a higher intelligence to the algorithm. We'll be back in a moment. Dr. Schroder, I have a question for you. We had planned this to end at the hour, and we 99.9% of the time we do. And I treasure your time. Are you available beyond this hour?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to stay on.
Okay.
I mean, the conversation is extremely interesting.
Well,
to me. Yeah,
well,
sure.
I'm very touched that you feel that way. It certainly is to me, and I know to my listeners, I didn't even mention the number, and the lines are filled. But now I'll mention the number because Dr. Schroder will stay on. I do, though, need to just get a response from our NASA engineer for a moment. Frank, I just need to understand. I'm the layman between the two of you. You're both in different sciences. The creation of algorithms on computers is done by a higher intelligence, namely the human being.
No.
You mean computers would do it without humans?
Yeah, computers write their own algorithms. What the programmers do is they put in a seed. They put in what's called a rule. And the rule is how...
Right. But forgive me, Frank. Forgive me. I'm not interrupting out of rudeness. That's the point, though, that I'm making. And that is that at some point there was intervention or creation by a higher intelligence.
No, but as far as evolution in life goes, the only rule that needs to be applied is that things that don't work die. Once you have that rule, and it's not a rule, it's inherent in the system. Yeah. Once you have that, all the rest follows.
All right, but how did the system begin?
Well, truthfully, Dennis, we don't know. I mean, I have to.
Well, why does it not suggest to you that this staggering complexity from electronic beams to you? It does not have a higher intelligence involved.
Because,
why is that less?
I work with complexity every day. That's my field. I know where complexity comes from. I know how to create it. And I know that it doesn't come from intelligent design because we can't do that. I mean, maybe God could. You know, you can make an argument that God's super intelligent and could create something intelligently. But as far as designing stuff, designers tend to go for simplicity, not complexity. Complexity only can happen with one type of design, and that's non-intelligent. When random variables are created and then they're tried and they're rejected because the system lives or dies, we see it every day. This is how complexity happens. This is the only way complexity can happen, in my opinion.
All right, Professor Schroder.
The rule that's put in, first of all, we have the basic question about complexity and not complexity goes back from the very beginning of the basis that's in anything. What Dennis was saying about this idea of light beams becoming alive, I said it and Dennis was repeating. The rule of complexity that's put in that allows what works or doesn't work. Works or doesn't work in what respect? I'm missing the point there. You said it either rejects what doesn't work or accepts what does work.
I don't know. The organism needs to see, or it will be eaten by prey, by predators. We'll be back in a moment. We're going to continue with Professor Schroder on the Dennis Prager Show. You can call in now.